Hello, my name is Nathan Lawson and I am from the Oxford Climate Society. I'm starting a new podcast called the Climate Breakdown. It aims to break down the barriers of race and class within the climate movement. For the first episode, we're going to be talking about food and the climate. What's the relationship between the two? The professor that I'm going to be interviewing is called Marco Springmann. He's a senior researcher at the Oxford Martin School and he runs a very famous project called The Future of Food. Some of the questions that I'm going to be asking him is about affordability. If you're from a low-income family like myself, how can you change your diet in a very affordable way and a practical way? Second thing I'm going to ask him is about cultural barriers. If you're from a family that eats a lot of meat and dairy, how can you overcome those cultural barriers such that your diet becomes more sustainable? What are some of the environmental impacts of agriculture, particularly with respect to the climate as well?
Sure. Agriculture has really huge planetary impacts on climate change, water use, land use, fertilizer application. And the impacts are really that big that some scientists have conceptualized them in terms of the so-called planetary boundary framework. So when scientists think about what impacts humans have on the environment, then you can structure that in various domains. So climate change is a prominent example. Scientists have come up with what they think is a planetary boundary for climate change, and that is basically in line with the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree target. So if we have global warming more than 2 degrees, we really put key ecosystems at risk.
Right. So the 2 degree is the planetary boundary, but 1.5 is the what we're aiming for.
Obviously better, yes.
Yeah, which is increasingly unlikely.
At the moment, it's all very ambitious.
Okay.
Then there are land use boundaries that are related to preserving key ecosystems like the Amazon that have very important roles for example, with sequestering carbon, but also as a habitat to biodiversity, so that is tightly interlinked. And there is a water boundary that tries to preserve the environmental flows of river systems. So if those dry up, then also stored water and water silos basically dry up, and there could be problems to it. And then you have a boundary called biogeochemicals, and those are related to nitrogen and phosphorus that we extract and apply on our fields, but then very often we don't close the loops, so to say. So we, for example, extract nitrogen from the air by the so-called Haber-Bosch process. We use that to make fertilizer, and then we just dump it on the ground, and very often it runs off and then runs into river systems and leads to water pollution.
Right. So there's many different impacts of agriculture, but if we just break down agriculture into, say, plant-based and animal, can you just talk about some of the differences between the two?
Yeah, we see really a big difference and almost a two-tier impact system. So if we look at climate change, for example, there we see that up to three quarters of all emissions that are associated with food production are due to the production of animal products, and most of those due to beef and dairy, beef, lamb, and dairy. And the reason there is that those products come from ruminant animals, meaning they have multiple stomachs, and they have multiple sources of emission. So in addition to needing quite a lot of feed, and most of that feed would need to be fertilized to some degree. Even when they eat grass, lots of grass would be fertilized. And while fertilizing crops, a potent greenhouse gas is generated called nitrous oxide. But when the ruminant animals digest those feeds, there is a second impact, because while digesting, they produce another potent greenhouse gas called methane. And a cow would sporadically burp up that methane, and that is another very...
and methane, I think it's 28 times, there's different estimates,
exactly,
more potent, which means it captures more, 28 times the amount of heat as a carbon dioxide molecule.
Yeah, it's always a bit tricky how you measure that, and this metric of global warming potential, sort of averaged or integrated over like 100 years, is a bit under criticism at the moment. So
a little bit of discrepancy there.
Yeah, so depending on what you look at, what you're interested in, you might want to use different metrics, but broadly it's more impactful than, at least on a short-term basis, it's much more impactful than carbon dioxide, whereas carbon dioxide is much more important on a long-term basis.
Brilliant. So so like you said, animal agriculture is responsible for 3/4 of emissions. Within animal agriculture, a lot of people I know are reducing their, say, beef consumption or lamb consumption, but they're moving to other meats which are increasing, such as chicken and fish as well. What is this an issue, or is that okay to do to reach our climate change?
Well, we calculated what kind of diet can you actually have to stay within planetary boundaries if everybody were to change their diets, and we constructed a diet that should not only be low in environmental impacts but also fairly healthy. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense that people eat that. And there we found that a predominantly plant-based diet would be sort of the best shot if you combined it with technological changes and reductions in food loss and waste. And the limit that we found that sort of roughly made it in combination with those other things was a diet that wouldn't have more than 1 serving of red meat per week. And red meat means beef, lamb, but also pork. Not more than 2 servings of poultry per week. Not more than 2 servings of fish per week. And if it contains dairy, then not more than 1 serving of dairy per day. So fairly plant-based, but still a little bit of other animal products. So if you compare that diet to a diet that that most people have in high-income countries, then almost all animal source foods would actually need to be reduced. Right. So we, for example, in the UK, the reduction in red meat would need to be like 90% almost. So the overconsumption is almost by a factor of 10. So we consume 10 times more than we could if we were all to be within planetary boundaries. For poultry, it's more like the reduction should be something like 60%, and for dairy also something like 60%. So just substituting would lower your personal carbon footprint a bit, because beef is roughly 10 times more emissions intensive than poultry. But it wouldn't be enough for you to claim that you have a sustainable diet by any means.
Brilliant, because I know a lot of people who aren't ready to go 100% vegan for whatever reason, maybe cultural reasons, maybe they just like the taste too much. They would move to sources such as fish. What about the argument of protein? So a lot of my friends who again aren't ready to go vegan, they say, but Nathan, I need protein. Is that a myth, or is that?
Yeah, it's quite a myth. I mean, there is no recorded case of protein deficiency amongst people who get their normal energy intake, because it's just, from an accounting perspective, is really almost not possible. Right. Because protein is in almost everything. So one of the biggest protein sources in the British diet is wheat. Not because wheat has so much protein, but because we eat lots of wheat, like bread, right? Yeah. And because almost everything has protein, that in some ends up to be a very big source of protein. When we analyze the diets we construct, we usually do a full nutritional analysis as well. And if you make sure you get sort of a serving of legumes like beans and lentils a day, there is really sufficient. Yeah, nuts have lots of protein as well, whole grains, as I said. So there is really no way you can be protein deficient.
Brilliant. And then what are some of the discrepancies again between developing countries and developed countries? Because I know you've done different models comparing the two. What are some of the differences?
Yeah, the differences are quite interesting. So if you look on an absolute basis, then if we stick with the example of greenhouse gas emissions and the climate impact, then you see that roughly 3/4 of the impact, total emissions impact, are actually from developing countries, just because so many people live there, right? So it's a numbers game. But if you look at the per capita emissions, then you see that developed countries have roughly 3 to 4 times bigger carbon footprint if we look at the food system than low-income countries have.
So therefore we almost have, to solve this climate change issue, we have more of an obligation to reduce our carbon footprint because they're so high per capita. That's the key point, because a lot of people, sometimes a lot of academics actually blame things like population growth for our emissions issue, and my response to them would be always look at the per capita emissions.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We actually ran our analysis through different projections of population growth, higher, lower than expected, and we find that really didn't have very much of an impact if you think about realistic projections of how populations develop. The only little bit of sort of feedback we had was with reductions in food loss and waste. So if you reduce food loss and waste a lot, then you can stay on a normal population trajectory. If you reduce it sort of in a medium ambitious way, then it would be better to go on a population trajectory that has a bit fewer people. But still, I mean, the argument can't be, okay, we need to sort of address, like saying that there are too many people is not really the answer, right? I mean, you need to think about economic development policies, access to reproductive medicine and all those things, and education for girls really in developing countries.
Exactly.
And those are important things on their own, right?
Yeah, because focusing on some of those issues, for example, the education of women, also has a positive impact for the climate, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interestingly, actually, almost in all, throughout all populations, men usually have higher footprints of their diets. Yeah, they eat more meat. They eat more in general. Mostly, they have a higher requirement for energy intake often, right? But that's they really also have usually more unhealthy diets. So men should listen more to women when it comes to food, for sure.
Brilliant. We're going to move on to policies in a moment, but before that, I still want to talk about the developing countries. So because there's a lot of ethical issues, for example, with something like a meat tax, of imposing such a tax on developing countries. So if we were to talk about something like tax, it would be more worth our energy to put that into developed countries. Is that an appropriate assumption?
In developing countries it can be a bit trickier. So we did a global analysis of taxing foods according to their greenhouse gas impacts. Mm-hmm. And in high income countries it's almost any tax design would get you both a climate benefit and a health benefit, because people would change their diets when they suddenly see a higher price for red meat, for example, for beef, and that would usually be associated with a reduction in dietary risks. So you get sort of health and environmental aspects going hand in hand. For very low income countries, you can take India as an example. If you make food more expensive, then you risk increasing the amount of malnourished people in the population, and that could backfire.
So have a negative impact.
Exactly. So there you really need to think how you design the tax. So we ran through, I think it was like 16 different tax designs, and even for India we found a tax design that can actually result in both environmental and health benefits. And there the trick is really to think carefully what you do with the tax revenues, because you don't want that people are put at a disadvantage. You want to help them, right? And sort of
what about subsidies, perhaps?
Exactly. So if you make something more expensive, I mean, the idea is you want people to eat that less, right? So that is good, right? So if they don't buy it, then you actually achieve your aim. But you probably also want that instead of that what you make more expensive, you probably want them to eat something else instead. And if you make that,
result, yeah.
Exactly. So if you make fruits and vegetables cheaper, for example, and you exempt stable grains that might be important in places like India and other low-income countries, then you can get to a configuration where people stay away from those high-impact foods that you don't want them to consume, and they consume those more sustainable ones. And we found that if a policy is successful in actually shifting the demand like that, then also the financial cost for buying those foods would be cheaper. So if it's successful in changing diets, you will spend less at the end of the day for your food, because sometimes it's brought up, it's financially regressive, right? And it hits poor households.
Yeah.
But it's not true. If the households actually change their diets, then it doesn't hit them disproportionately. So the key is really to help them to change, and that usually wouldn't be accomplished only through taxation, so you need to connect it also to education programs, maybe cooking classes even.
So this is the key point, because a lot of people think, for example, it's one approach, but it's very, very interdisciplinary, and this is the thing that I want more people to understand. Is to solve climate change, it's not just targeting one aspect, right? It's, for example, focusing on education, like we talked about. So in developing countries, can you think of an example where this has perhaps worked? Policies and taxation and subsidies? Or is it still a work in progress?
Yeah, it would be nice to have one example at all where it worked. So politicians are very skirmish when it comes to taxes, right? Because it opens them up so easily for campaigns against. And there are lots of interest groups, obviously. So
carbon taxing, I know it's not a developing country, but France, sorry, that got a massive backlash.
There you go, right? Denmark had a saturated fat tax at some point, so that effectively worked like a meat tax. Had to be taken back after a very short time, even though ex post modeling after the effect showed that it actually contributed to a slight improvement in dietary risks. So those things can be very effective, but politicians really need to have the guts to push it through. Something like, case in point, the sugar drinks taxes, right? I mean, if there hadn't been a public awareness campaign and a push from the public to actually say, yeah, we want those, we want better population health. If that hadn't been there, politicians wouldn't have had the guts to actually implement anything like that.
Brilliant. Okay, brilliant. So, moving on to more, say, developed countries. What are some of the most effective top-down approaches to help people transition to a more sustainable diet, that being vegan?
So when we think about how can you help people to consume a healthy and sustainable diet, then basically you need to have policies that address the whole supply chain, or the whole food chain, in fact, right? So sometimes it's instructive to think about it from both a consumption perspective, a production perspective, and something in the middle, like for example catering or so, right? So if we start at the consumption perspective, then obviously consumers need to know what is healthy and sustainable, and they need to be able to have access to healthy and sustainable meals, right? So one of the first things that need to be in order are national dietary guidelines. And at the moment we're doing a big analysis where we look at all national dietary guidelines around the world, and most of them don't conform to any standard or any aspects of sustainability. So if we modeled what would happen if everybody would actually eat according to those dietary guidelines, would we be able to stay within those planetary boundaries that I mentioned earlier? And for really the great majority, except for some very poor countries that at the moment don't have high meat consumption, and therefore they don't recommend high meat consumption. So all of those countries at the moment fail on sustainability aspects in their national dietary guidelines. So they really need to...
That's not a priority then, right?
Yeah, but they could also be healthier. So we analyze both the environmental impacts and the healthiness. And what we found very often is that they just doctor around the edges, right? So they try
why do you think that is that?
Well, guidelines are political documents, right? So politicians probably think, we can't drastically change what citizens eat, so we try to influence maybe one thing. So in the UK, you might notice that everybody talks about 5 a day, right? Do you get your 5 a day? So politicians decided to a degree that is an important message, and it definitely is an important message. But if you don't also address, for example, proper limits to animal source foods, then there is no way that any diet, even though it would adhere to this 5 a day, would be sustainable, right?
So come back to that idea of this one solution, right? It doesn't work. So you need to look at it from multiple perspectives. So I think that is important, to first get the house in order and deliver an informed message to the public.
But then obviously you need to act on it. I mean, what is found over and over again is that provision of information alone usually doesn't work. It only works if you combine it with other measures. For example, tax approaches where you that are aimed at showing what the real cost of food is, right? At the moment, we don't pay for climate change damages when we look at the price of foods, even though they are so much associated with emissions and by that with climate damages. We also don't pay for the large health costs associated with diet-related chronic diseases like heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes. We calculated if, for example, just processed meat would have actually the price tag of the healthcare costs related to eating processed meat and to the diet-related diseases you get from eating it, then it should be double its price almost in the UK, right? And the climate cost can be 40% more than the market cost as well.
So that goes to show that, I mean, the information is already out there, but clearly that's not enough. You need policies that make that transition easier, right? Because I come from a low income background, and a big barrier to a more vegan or plant-based diet is the cost aspect of it, right? Or at least the perceived cost aspect. So yeah, how can we make it easier for low income families, for example, to transition?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It has to start somewhere, right? And I mean, what you want as a policymaker is that you provide the right incentives, and then in that framework, businesses can innovate, right? So if they see an advantage of then producing more options for healthy and sustainable meals, then it would be beneficial for them to do that, right? If you think about the food environment at the moment, it's still very hard to find actually something that is healthy and sustainable in a canteen, in a restaurant. So you somehow need to think about what are incentives you can put up as a regulator to make sure that you always have that option there. I mean, obviously, if you're a caterer, you can just say, okay, I always want a healthy and sustainable meal there, right? And the University of Cambridge has gone down that route, and I applaud that very much. They have taken beef off the menu in their canteens.
Was that very controversial?
Yes, it was very controversial, and I hear interest groups are still up in arms, but they have very good arguments, right? I mean, red meat, like beef, has been declared a likely carcinogen to humans by the World Health Organization. So there is no reason why a public entity should expose their customers to a probable carcinogen or likely carcinogen, and it's the most highly impactful food group when you think about climate change.
So win-win for health and climate.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's the role of business in this? Because I went to a talk at John Lewis about corporate social responsibility. And they was talking about being just ahead of the customer in terms of providing those those vegan options or those low carbon alternatives, but not so far ahead that they're like, you forced this upon me. What's the role of businesses?
Yeah, you hear that a lot. I mean, there was some trying of phasing in some more plant-based products, I think even 10 years ago. So every once in a while businesses try again, but if customers don't pick it up, it doesn't work for them. Businesses usually react to trends, right? So if we don't change before, we don't demand it, or there is not a demand out there that can in some form create it or incentivized, then they won't do it, right? But if it's clear that there is such a big issue and people become more aware, then for businesses it makes sense to produce a product that's geared towards it. So
their biggest fear is, for example, coming out with a whole new range and either no one buying it, or removing a certain range, for example, taking beef off the menu, and them losing the customers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, they have a very important role, but I see them more as reacting to either trends or the threat of regulation. Right. For example, some public health researchers that work very often with industry, they look at sort of reformulation efforts, right? Where you sort of trick the customer to not perceive a difference. But for example, salt reduction is a good example. That has worked very well there, But when you think about changes to healthy and sustainable diets, it really wouldn't work so well, because there you really need to restructure what you eat fundamentally.
Brilliant. Okay, so we talked a bit about the policy changes. Now I want to focus more on an individual level. So there's a few points. One is, a lot of people say, if I went vegan, it's not going to have that much of an impact. And if you just look at the numbers, I know that the wealthiest 1%, for example, are responsible for a high percentage of emissions. What would be your response to people who doubt the impact of their own individual actions, or say that it doesn't amount to anything?
Well, I always think there needs to be both. I mean, if you don't change yourself, how can you demand others to change, right? And I think personal action is a really important pressuring device for politicians. Again, I think they're always afraid of losing the vote, losing their constituencies. So if we don't show them that we're ready for change, they wouldn't do anything. So I think we do have a responsibility to first change and then demand it from others.
I know you do a lot of work on this in terms of how attitudes influence policy rather than the other way around, right? So would you argue that attitude has to come first, change first?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about if a policymaker rolls out a policy and doesn't take people on board, it's perceived as paternalistic, right? Oh, they just prescribe stuff and we actually don't like it. So it's really important to have conversations, make sure you get people on board, explain why you do things, and it always helps if people already change to some degree, right? And are on board with the policy. And if you change yourself, you usually talk about it, right? Hopefully you talk about it in a non-ideologic, non-moralistic way. But if you do that, it's likely that you can have conversations with others and make them aware of the challenges out there.
Brilliant. Now, you come from Germany, don't you?
Yes.
And I'm from an Indian family, and so one of the topics I want to talk about is the cultural barriers to again changing a diet. So I'm from an Indian family that drink a lot of milk, a lot of dairy. When I go to my grandma's house, she's just like, drink milk. What would you say to people who use the cultural argument, or say that it's a barrier to changing your diet?
I don't think culture is a good argument. I mean, it's tossed around very often as the barrier, and you must everything needs to be culturally appropriate. But what does that mean, right? I mean, culture is constantly changing. And we don't, I mean, if you look at what people eat now, that is totally different than a couple of decades ago.
Right.
If you think why our parents eat what they eat, right? They probably have just gotten some money and then they wanted to spend it on what foods they regarded as sort of high-valued foods, right? And it so happened that in very many cases, those were animal source foods. So they thought, okay, by eating that, they express their higher status or something. So they wanted to communicate that, but they probably didn't know better that it's actually not tremendously healthy and it's very unsustainable. Exactly. So if they had known that, they might not have done it. Right. So I think if you have a conversation about those drivers, what you actually want to express in your culture, then you can have a more informed discussion. For example, also the milk in India, right?
Yes.
In places it makes a lot of sense to actually not be nutrient deficient to have some milk, sure. Right? But if you have a food system that can deliver
nutrients, for example,
more a big diversity of fruits and vegetables, then you might not need that much milk anymore. Exactly. But you only get to that conversation if you discuss what you want to do, why you eat what you eat, right. And what the motivation might be.
So it's not like you have to replace your culture for the sake of sustainability, but rather that they can be used together.
Exactly, you can work within the culture, right? Very nice example is the new Nordic diet, right? The Nordic countries, they didn't have such a good food culture, I would say, but they then put together this council and developed what is basically a Mediterranean diet, a local Mediterranean diet, but for Nordic countries. And it has sustainability impacts in there, and it's a high class diet. It's an aspirational diet, and now it's very much associated with the Nordic countries. So they really managed to actually change culture in a way, but by taking on board locally available foods, taking on board tradition, but changing it to
So
basically update it.
Together, right. Brilliant. And then just the last point to finish off, try and keep it positive. In an ideal world, say 10 years from now, what would you like the agricultural system to look like?
Well, that is really another of the missing pieces when we look at the food system. We talk now about consumption, something in the middle, but not production. And of course, production systems need to change if we want to have a sustainable food system. And for that, agriculture incentives need to change dramatically. At the moment, within the EU, there are lots of payments for growing something on the land, and there are no really incentives to do something that is, there are a couple of incentives to do something that is environmentally benign, but not enough. And there is nothing that incentivizes you to change the portfolio of what you're growing. Now, the UK government claims that after Brexit you can have such an agricultural policy. And whilst that might be true, the bill that has been just introduced into Parliament still doesn't have really teeth when it comes to that crops. But you could, for example, think about rewilding that would increase biodiversity
And absorb more carbon, right?
Yeah, and you could even think about afforesting, right? Growing more trees that would suck.
So it'd be a lot more efficient, in terms of land use.
Yeah.
We switched to more plant-based.
We actually, even for the UK, we calculated that if you switch to a more plant-based diet, you wouldn't need so many grains that would be fed to animals,
Right.
and you would actually free up some land, some cropland. That you could, for example, use for converting crop production to organic. That would use a bit more cropland, so you could balance it. You could use it for being less import dependent on fruits and vegetables, so grow that a bit more. And those pasture lands that you free up, you can use for biodiversity, afforestation, or broadly ecosystem services. That would be very important. But for all of those, you need the right incentives, because farmers need to make a living somehow, and it should be in nobody's interest to get farmers out of business.
Brilliant. Well, I think that we've covered everything from policy to individual action to cultural barriers. I think that's everything. Thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure.